My name is Yael Leibowitz. I was invited to be a part of this project because I've been lucky enough to know the extended Lamb family for many years. Probably shouldn't have been in public because some of the Lamb children have been some of my favorite students of all time. I'm lucky enough to work with a number of members of the family, and of course we live in West Hempstead with a large contingent of the family that contributes on an ongoing basis to acts of chesed and Torah learning within the community. And so the loss of someone dear to them really touched everyone and anyone that knows them. And so I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes tonight learning together Perek Kuf Lamed Bet, Le'iloi Nishmat Sarah Rivka Bar Harav Nachum Umindel. So Perek Kuf Lamed Bet is one of the prakim of Shir HaMa'alot, or what's known as the Psalms of Ascent. And it's really dealing primarily with two issues. It's dealing with what's known as the Davidic covenant, or the promise made to David HaMelech that his dynasty will be enduring and everlasting, as well as the centrality of Zion, or Tzion, really as the location of Aron Hashem, in the resting place of the Ark of Hashem, and of course by extension Hashem. It's actually interesting. It's been suggested that the entire Mizmor could be broken down neatly into three component parts, each one containing a petition by man to God and a divine response. And so just by way of example, in the very beginning of the parak, we have the request. It says, Zichor Hashem leDavid et kol unoto. There's a request that God should remember all of the these sort of extreme measures really taken by David HaMelech in an attempt to find a resting place for Aron Hashem. And of course that's responded to in the second half of the Mizmor in Perek Yud Bet, for example, where Hashem responds, and I'm just going to be paraphrasing here, where Hashem makes very clear that the dynasty, as I mentioned, will be everlasting, contingent of course on the fact that on whether or not the children of David remain loyal to their ends of the covenant. What I wanted to just spend a couple of moments on tonight is the way in which two psukim actually from this Mizmor are utilized by a later work of Tanakh. If we look in psukim Chet and Tet, we find something very interesting. The psukim are really in keeping with the theme that we've been speaking about. It says, Kuma Hashem limenuchatecha, atav aronu zecha. It's speaking to Hashem, and it's saying, Hashem, and I'm paraphrasing again, Hashem should go up or advance towards his resting place, God and his Aron, his ark. Kohanecha yilbeshu tzedek v'chasidecha yiraninu. And then it speaks of the priests of Hashem, the Kohanim, being clothed in triumph, and the loyal ones singing for joy. We know that Divrei Hayamim is one of the latest Svarim ever to be written in Tanakh. It was written after the return of the Jews to Eretz Yisrael, or what was then known as Judea, after the exile, after Galut Babel. And it's essentially sort of a retelling of everything that happened from the beginning of humanity through the Persian period. What's interesting, though, of course, is that Divrei Hayamim relied very heavily on earlier texts and, of course, earlier oral traditions that pre-existed. And so even though they were writing about events that took place in the past, they were relying heavily on the way in which those events had been told in the past. At the same time, though, of course, as would be expected, they were also revising or reworking those earlier works as a means of articulating their unique worldview and their unique outlook, fashioned, of course, by the historical circumstances that they were forced to contend with or that they had to deal with. What's interesting, and so in Melachim Aleph, when Shlomo HaMelech finishes building the Beit HaMikdash, he offers up a tefillah to Hashem, and he offers up a tefillah that Hashem should come to the Beit HaMikdash, and of course that the Beit HaMikdash, he describes what the Beit HaMikdash, the function of the Beit HaMikdash, and how it functions within the context of the relationship of the people and God. And that's really the ending of the dedication ceremony that he performs after the Beit HaMikdash was constructed and furnished. It's not surprising, of course, that Divrei Hayamim, when it tells about the dedication ceremony that took place during the days of Shlomo, that Divrei Hayamim, as we mentioned, would utilize the tefillah of Shlomo HaMelech in their own retelling. What's interesting, though, for our discussion is that the tefillah of Shlomo HaMelech ends at a certain place in Melachim, in its original place, so to speak, and when Divrei Hayamim recapture that moment or retell of that event, they don't end at the original place where Shlomo HaMelech ends, but they actually borrow these 2 psukim that we just read and tack it on to the end of his tefillah as if it was organic to the original tefillah. And so what's interesting, of course, and what we have to sort of try to make sense of, is what Divrei Hayamim was doing, tacking on these 2 psukim that speak about the movement, the actual movement of God into the Beit HaMikdash and the illustrious role of the Kohanim, what that was doing as the culmination of the tefillah of Shlomo HaMelech that really ended with a very simple appeal in Malachim that Hashem should respond to the appeals of Am Yisrael. So in order to, I think, answer this question, we just need to reacquaint ourselves with the history or the context of that produced really Divrei Hayamim. And so if we look back, the period of the exile, the galut that was a result of the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, really presented the Jewish people with unprecedented challenges, religious challenges, national challenges, and perhaps most profound among them was the theological crisis that was wrought when the temple, the locus of their religious worship up until that point was destroyed. And what the people really had to wrestle with or make sense of was how they were going to continue maintaining a relationship with God and continue understanding their role within religion in the absence of that temple. And what the Nevi'im during that period, so for example, Yirmiyahu leading up to the period, and then Yecheskel perhaps even more prominently, addressed through their Nevuot was a means by which the people could continue to relate to and to commune with God in the absence of that physical building. And so concepts like the universal nature of God were accentuated, whereas they hadn't necessarily been accentuated at earlier points. Or the concept that God is a mikdash ma'at, a diminished temple, sort of a metaphor for this idea that they could reach out to God in any lands that they found themselves, was something that really gained import and really resonated with the people during that period. And it enabled them, if you think about it, to cope with the loss of a temple and to not only survive in Galut, but to thrive in those intervening years. Of course, the what we might call a theological coping mechanism actually proved to be a double-edged sword, because as we know, when Bnei Israel were finally allowed to go back to Eretz Yisrael after the decree of Cyrus, and they were allowed to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, what we see from the words of Chagai Zechariah, for example, the post-exilic Nevi'im, or from the narrative accounts of Ezra Nehemiah telling of the events of that period, is an apathy or a lack of enthusiasm when it comes to the rebuilding project. You would imagine that they would come back and want to rebuild instantaneously, but actually instead what we find is this, what strikes us perhaps as an ambivalence. And if you think about it, really what created that ambivalence was the ideas articulated by the Nevi'im during the exile itself. And so if you create a means by which people can conceive of a religion that precludes the Beit HaMikdash, then by definition it really calls into question on some level the very need for a second temple at all, and not only for a second temple, but for the daily sacrifice and for the institution of the Kohanim themselves. And this ambivalence really is addressed by the efforts of Chagai Zechariah to excite the people when it came to the building project, and of course in the works of Ezra Nehemiah, as we mentioned. What's very interesting, and what I think is happening here in Divrei Hayamim, when Divrei Hayamim utilizes these 2 psukim, what they're essentially saying, and what they're really, to a degree, projecting onto their own period, even though they're theoretically speaking about an earlier period and the earlier dedication of the Beit HaMikdash, what they're really doing is driving home the import or the need to not only build a Beit HaMikdash, but the means by which a Beit HaMikdash really once again is being spoken about as the place where God's presence will move to, and a place where the Kohanim will exist in all of their glory. And so by culminating the Tefillah of Shlomo HaMelech with these 2 Baruch Psukim, Divrei Hayamim is really reinforcing a notion that was, to a degree, up for debate in the Second Temple period, or in the early Second Temple period. Of course, as we know, the building project did pick up momentum, and it did increase not only in popularity, but also in popular support as the years ensued. And throughout the rest of the period of Bayit Sheni, a discussion, the temple really was the fulcrum, or at the very least was the starting point for any discussion about Second Temple religion. And so I think that if we think about it, the use of Divrei Hayamim, or perhaps I'll say it the other way, I think that Tehillim, Mizmor, Kuf Lamed Bet, but in general, I think Tehillim has a magical way of meaning something to everyone that recites it. I think that not every time we say Tehillim, but I think very, very often we are lucky enough to have the experience that the words of Tehillim almost transcend the historical circumstances or transcend the original context of their words. And we almost feel as if the words were written for us at this very moment. And I think that what we see by the borrowing of the psukim from our Mizmor in the later work of Divrei Hayamim is that this experience is really as old as Tanakh itself. And I think that this learning project really that we are all a part of is a phenomenal example of the ongoing experience that we're speaking about, and a means by which the continued study of Sefer Tehillim can prove to be not only a nechama, but a source of inspiration for us all. Yehi Zichra Baruch.